My name is Victor Fuhrman. Some call me the Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me now and we will explore these topics and so much more with fascinating guests, authors, and experts who will guide us to Destination Unlimited. Trauma has always been part of the human experience. Our knowledge of the neurological and physical effects of trauma has grown over the last decade, and few people realize that experiencing trauma doesn't have to sentence you to a lifetime of suffering and grief. My guest this week on Destination Unlimited, Dr. Edith Shiro, is a licensed clinical psychologist with a private practice in Miami, where she specializes in trauma, post-traumatic stress, and post-traumatic growth. Recognized as an expert in the field of post-traumatic growth, Dr. Shiro has focused her attention on immigration and acculturation issues, working directly with refugees and torture survivors. Her website is dredithshiro.com, and she joins me this week to share her experience, research, and new book, The Unexpected Gift of Trauma. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Edith Shiro. Welcome, Dr. Shiro.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be joining you today.
And thank you for joining us. And your topic in your book is very, very important, especially taking our world situation into consideration at this time. So please tell us about your early life and your initial understanding of trauma based upon the experience of your grandparents.
Yes. So my book, The Unexpected Gift of Trauma, Path to Post-Traumatic Growth, comes from more than 25 years of practice and research and some personal experiences and stories too. And really what inspired me from the beginning, and thank you for that question, because I usually don't talk about so much my personal things, but this is super relevant in why I'm so drawn to the topic of trauma. I come from a family of Holocaust survivors. My grandparents were the sole survivors of their families in the Holocaust. And then my other grandparents are refugees from Syria. And I grew up with stories of trauma, stories of survival, stories of immigration, of moving from one place to another, having to change, a lot of loss, a lot of transformation. And I always saw people around me in my own community also, of some people that were very stuck in their trauma and that would repeat and, their pain, and they develop post-traumatic stress and all kinds of things. Then I saw another group of people that were sort of like doing better, and they would like cope with things, and they were like kind of navigating life. And then I saw a third group of people, and my grandfather is in that group, that not only were doing better, but were thriving, and they were transforming, and they became wiser and more conscious and would appreciate life more. And that really caught my attention early on in life. And my studies in psychology were related to like how people do better, like what makes the difference between people that cannot do it and people that can. How come some people react in one way and some other people react in another way? What makes the difference? Is it personality? Is it culture? Is it past experiences? Is it biological? Is it nature, nurture? So I kept asking all those questions. And throughout all these years, I realized that there was a process that I call post-traumatic growth that has stages that people really, if people know that this is a possibility, you can enter it, you can go through it, and you can have a very, very meaningful transformational experience coming out of something as traumatic or as painful, as difficult as trauma.
And we're going to talk about that a little later on in the interview, but I'm curious as to what led you to your path as a healer and specifically working with trauma patients.
I think because I had those kind of conversations very, very young in my life with my grandparents. They would tell me stories all the time. And my parents were also immigrants in in the country where I was living. I was born in Venezuela, and both my parents come from different parts of Europe, and then my grandparents come from all these other parts of Syria and Romania and Hungary, and the community that I grew up in Venezuela also had all these stories of survival. And I think I was feeling always like a little bit like an outsider, like I was looking at things from the outside, because I never felt like I was 100% similar or belonging to the community that I was. And then when I moved to the US, to United States, very young, when I was 17, I also felt again like an outsider, because then I was becoming not a Latina in an American country, or I was being a Jew in like the US or in Venezuela. And like I was always having like to redefine my identity. And I always had to like see people from different points of view, including myself, how they would see me, how I would see them. So I was always very psychologically minded in that way. My friends in high school would always call me like I'm the psychologist there. So I had that from like very young age. And specifically trauma, I think, because literally I think I have had it from these generations and generations of having that traumatic experiences that I think I carry in my body. And I needed to understand where that was coming from. And I needed to make sense of the things that I was feeling and the things that I was dreaming about and the reactions that I was having toward different, and my sensitivity to certain topics. And I said, this is not just me. It feels like it's coming from my ancestors. It's coming from my people. It's coming from my history. So this led me to be more curious about this.
But curiosity could lead a number of ways, and specifically you chose to help people. Just why? I'm just curious.
I think that there's in some ways the people that like you, like me, and I think like you too, that chooses to help people or to heal people. In some ways, I don't think it's a decision that comes from the head. I think there's a decision. It's a decision that comes from a more instinctive place. I think that it comes more natural to me. I think I have had some training when I was a little girl, probably in helping those around me and helping my parents adjust to the culture where they were coming from, because I was a native, but they weren't. In helping my grandparents, in helping my brothers, in helping the people around me. But also I think it's because there was something that resonated with me in like being very sensitive to the other, and being very empathic and being very in tune with other people's feelings. And I don't know if we can choose that, or if we're more born with that, or we get to develop that because of our circumstances. So that was always a place that I felt very comfortable with, and that came very natural to me. And I got very rewarded for that too. My friends in school from early on, they were looking for me, they were trusting me. So I think it just happened naturally in my case.
We share the experience of service through the Red Cross after 9/11. My wife and I both served as chaplains at the Family Assistance Center that was set up to provide services and comfort for those awaiting word of their loved ones, and also first responders and ground zero workers. Please tell us about your service with the Red Cross as a volunteer psychologist in the aftermath of 9/11.
Well, it started in 9/11 and then continued for other events. And it was a very interesting experience of me that was my first day, September 11th, and I was starting my training at the Ackerman Institute. I was there already for a few years, but that year started exactly that day. Oh. So as I was entering, it was like on the Upper East Side. And as I was 9 a.m, as I was entering the Ackerman Institute on Lexington Avenue, and I'm looking up and I'm seeing these videos on TV that I can't understand. I couldn't understand. My brain could not understand what was happening. All of a sudden I have all of my colleagues, everybody at the Ackerman Institute and everybody on the Upper East Side, were all running like crazy on the street. And at the time, I could not get to where I was. I was living in Westchester, and I couldn't even get to my home. And because I was around, I think some people mentioned my name to the Red Cross, and the Red Cross called me and a couple of other colleagues, and they required our presence on the west side of the city. We were all going to be gathered and debriefed and trained and start right away. I don't know if this happened to you, but we started right away that same night on a hotline to start attending to the survivors. And that lasted all night. And then the next day we were taken to ground zero. I remember using my helmet, a helmet that they gave me, and the ID and all of that. And we were pretty much spending the day in ground zero, seeing how we could give some support, do some debriefing, attend to the people that need it, see how, work with the community. And that lasted for like a week or so. I didn't really get to my home for the 2-3 days. And then finally I was able to get home, and then I continued working with the Red Cross. And then at some point, I was also called to work with a woman called Pauline Boss. She's the one that wrote a book called The Ambiguous Loss. I don't know if you've heard of her. And we were treating the families of the victims of Union, the people that were 42BJ. It was a union that was cleaning the windows of the World, and that was working in the restaurant of Windows of the World at that time. And a lot of them spoke Spanish, so they were calling me so I can work with the Spanish-speaking families. And we worked with these families also for a few weeks, and it was a very intense experience as well. But one of the big lessons, Victor, that I want to share with you about that is that we realize in the field of psychology that coming in right away and treating victims of trauma by doing debriefing and asking them to talk and tell the story over and over and over again is not helpful. I don't know if you remember this, or I don't know if this was your experience, but this was something that we were discussing in our groups with our colleagues in our analysis of what happened. Is like why we went in right away and asked these people to tell us what happened and how they're doing, because what we were doing was re-traumatizing the victims, and that was not the right thing to do at the time. And I think it was a big lesson for all of us working with trauma to know that more important than telling the story in that moment, which would only do more damage, would be to give more containment and to provide safety and support in that moment, and not so much giving information and not so much retelling the story over and over and over again. And I think that lesson has stayed with me for forever. And that's something that I applied a lot when I'm working with trauma. And that's something that I teach a lot and say, meet the person where the person is at, not because of what you need or the information you have to get or how much, how many words or how much expression you need to hear from the patient, but really what would be more convenient in terms of where they are at when they're traumatized. And that made a big difference.
And as chaplains, we were taught to be present for them, to be present and comforting, and to sacredly listen and just not say anything to stimulate a conversation, just to sacredly meet them where they were.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Absolutely. It was a time I'll never forget. We did that for 3.5 months after 9/11, and it was a time that neither of us will ever forget, and we're grateful for the opportunity to be of service to the community. So what inspired your new book, The Unexpected Gift of Trauma?
So, that's a book that I pretty much developed and did research on 25 years ago. And this was part of my doctoral dissertation. And I was working at that time with the Cambodian refugee community in the Bronx. And I was interviewing the Cambodian refugees that went through, as you know, a genocide back in 1979. And most of them fled either to LA or to the Bronx. And we had the privilege of really meeting with them and working with them. And I pretty much lived with them for a year, learning their customs, their traditions, their culture. I was very fortunate to have the social worker and a community leader work with me and introduce me to so many people. And it was beautiful. And from them, I started to do, I was very curious to see how from this group of people or this community, who were the ones that were thriving, who were the ones that were transformed by the experience, who were the ones that really stood out in terms of their evolution, their consciousness, their appreciation for life, their having a purpose in life. So I got to interview some of these members of the community, and I learned so much. And I did that previously with Holocaust survivors. And then from then on, I did that with like immigrants. I did that with torture survivors at Bellevue Hospital. And I did that also with refugees from Central America. And that kept going and for many years. And as I decided to publish that book, I sat down in 2019 to polish it and rewrite it. And as I was doing that, a lot of other things have happened that also informed my book. One of them was living in Miami. There was a collapse of the towers, the Surfside Towers. I don't know if you heard of that 98 people died. And it was in my community. I mean, a lot of these people were part of my community in Miami, and then were people from all over the world. And I was the psychologist in the place that was dealing with and providing support and organizing together with a group of therapists into how to help this community. And that was really literally as I was writing my book on the chapter on the collective trauma. This is what was happening. So throughout my practice of all these years, plus the experiences that I've had, personal and professional, I really think I wanted to send this message with the book and say how we go through difficulty, how we go through trauma, how we go through adversity. And there's a possibility of transforming that, of changing that, of transmuting it into growth, into consciousness, into wisdom, and how we can do that.
Beautiful. Thank you for doing this work. This is just amazing and beautiful work. So thank you so much for doing this.
It's a privilege, honestly. I learned so much every time. And every time I hear my patients or a group of people go through this, I get very moved every time, because, the people tell me, I would not want this to happen to anyone, or I would not wish this on anybody, but I would not change it for anything in the world, because these experiences have shaped me and make me who I am. And I would not want to change that. So that's a very powerful statement I hear over and over.
Absolutely. Let's clarify for our listeners a few terms that they may have a basic understanding of, but from a more clinical perspective. Let's start with the word trauma.
Yes. So trauma used to be, a more first of all, it came from the medical world, in which trauma was more of a physical a symptom or a diagnosis of a broken bone or a hit in the body. Then it was used more as a psychological term, especially for soldiers coming from the war that were traumatized. That's where PTSD started to develop, and shell shock and all these terms. But today, we understand that trauma is a much more expanded definition of an experience of an overwhelming, difficult experience for which we don't have the tools to face or to deal with. So any experience that can be overwhelming, or any experience that can be life-shattering, or any experience that shakes your belief system, for which you stop to understand who you are, who the other person is, and how the world works, and for which we don't have the tools or the resources to deal with, can be traumatizing. And I say that also keeping in mind that trauma is a very subjective definition or subjective experience, because I am not somebody that can tell you if you're traumatized or not, or if you are experiencing trauma. Because for some people, some experience can be very traumatizing, and the same experience is not traumatic for somebody else. So I always give the example of the pandemic. The pandemic can be a collective trauma, but for some people it was very traumatizing. For other people, it wasn't. And it can be the same circumstances, the same event, the same place, and people can experience it differently. So that's one way of understanding trauma. The other aspect of it is that it's relational. So trauma is not just what happens, but it's what happens inside of you and what happens with you in relationship to yourself, to the others, and to the world. Sometimes when our belief system gets shattered, how we understand ourselves and others in the world doesn't function anymore, doesn't work anymore, it can be very traumatizing. So that's also a definition of trauma that I use.
My guest is Dr. Edith Shiro. Her book is called The Unexpected Gift of Trauma. Dr. Shiro, please tell our listeners where they can get your book and find out more about you and your amazing work.
Thank you so much. So my book can be found at Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, Indie, Walmart, every platform, in Audible, in the Kindle, in all forms. And I'm really, really hoping that you get it. You can find me on Instagram, Dr. Edith Shiro, on Facebook, Dr. Edith Shiro, my website, www.dredithshiro.com. And I'm always open and available for feedback, for conversations, for dialogue, and to really keep the conversation going.
And we'll be back with more of Dr. Shiro after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
The cutting edge of conscious radio, OMTimes Radio, IOM FM. OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Hello, I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, host of OMTimes Magazine's flagship radio show, What is Going On? My passion is sifting through information, research, and innovations from new thought teachers, speakers, and researchers pushing back the boundaries of what we know about life, energy, metaphysics, and the universe. I love shifting perceptions about who we are, why we're here, and how quickly impossible becomes normal when we open our minds, expand our awareness, and accept that the only limits that exist are those we place upon ourselves. So if you're the kind of forward-thinking, eager investigator of what lies beyond the current reality that most perceive, why not make a date to come play with me in the field of possibilities at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Thursday, and together we can discover what's really going on.
Hi, I'm Danica Patrick. Watching my nieces grow, play, and learn is amazing, but not every child gets to be carefree. 1 in 6 kids in the U.S. are hungry. This breaks my heart, and it's something that Feeding America is working to change. Each year, the Feeding America network of food banks rescues billions of pounds of good food that would have gone to waste and gives it to families in need. To help, visit feedingamerica.org.
Brought to you by Feeding America and the Ad Council.
We've all felt left out. And for people who move to this country, that feeling lasts more than a moment. We can change that. Learn how at belongingbeginswithus.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Back with Dr. Edith Shiro. Her new book is called The Unexpected Gift of Trauma. Now, we were talking about trauma in the last segment, and most of us are familiar with the acronym PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. What is the genesis of this, and how does it manifest in those affected by it?
Okay, so PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder, and I came from understanding the symptoms that the soldiers that were coming from war in the United States pretty much were coming with symptoms that were they were unable to function with their families. They thought that they were missing their friends or the other soldiers that they were with. So they said, okay, go home, take a rest, and then come back to war. And that would make it even worse. I mean, there's an amazing story. I tell a little bit in my book, but the woman that really tells the story really well is Judith Herman. She's a psychiatrist in Boston that wrote a book called Trauma and Recovery. And she was pretty much one of the first ones that would advocate for these people that were very traumatized not to be sent back to war and not to be exposed to more trauma, and to really make PTSD a diagnosis for clinicians to say, these people are suffering severe symptoms of depression, of anxiety, hyperarousal, flashbacks, nightmares, inability to relate to others, to their own families, feeling numb, having dissociation, being dissociated from themselves, from their emotions, having responses of fight and flight and freeze. I mean, everything and anything you can imagine, physical pain, chronic illnesses. I mean, we still see it in our veterans of war, and it's unfortunate how pervasive this diagnosis is and how difficult it is to overcome it, and also that it affects not only the soldiers or the people that suffer PTSD, but also those around them. It's not just an individual diagnosis, but the people that live with somebody with PTSD are affected too, the families, the community, the society. So something to think about. It's not just the individual, but it's also all around it, and also the generations to come. Because one of the things, Victor, that I mentioned when I talk about trauma is that it's intergenerational. So all these things that we experience in this moment get registered in our bodies, like our very well-known psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk says, the body keeps a score. It's like everything gets registered in our bodies, even when we don't remember, and then we get to pass it on to our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, and that trauma, it's like a vicious cycle. So that the example usually is sexual abuse. When there's sexual abuse in one generation, it gets passed on into the next generation, then the next generation, alcoholism, and many other kinds of trauma that get passed on. So something to keep in mind, and to know that this is not just an isolated event.
Does the science of epigenetics come into play with trauma?
That's exactly right. And I love that you mentioned epigenetics, because a lot of people don't know about it. And it's pretty much, it's more recent that we're talking about epigenetics, and it's being developed even more. And epigenetics is the science that studies the expression of genes. And the information that we have in our DNA can be expressed or not expressed depending on the experiences that we have in our lives. And that's a fascinating concept, because it allows us to have some flexibility and some say into the information that we have biologically, and how we shape that, and that expression of the genes, not only for our lives, but for our children. So a mother that is pregnant and she's going through a lot of stress and a lot of traumas, and that baby is being developed, can absorb and manifest information in their genes that then gets later expressed. Whereas a baby that has been in the womb and with a mother that is more relaxed, or that it's more in harmony, and that it's more in a calm environment, that baby can be born with different information in their genes. So that's a fascinating piece of information and research that we need to take into account, and that has been shown that happens over and over. With different kinds of experiences and traumatic experiences as well.
So it's possible that if I had a great-great-great-great-grandfather who had a very horrible traumatic experience, that his genes were modified to carry, I guess, the genetic memory of that experience, and I could actually have that. Is that correct?
That's my understanding also. Again, I'm not the one doing the research on epigenetics, but right. From my readings and my understanding and my work, I've seen that. I've seen that not only personal, but professional. So, for example, the information that I have of being a Holocaust survivor, even though I've never been at war and I've never been in those circumstances in concentration camps, there's a piece of that information that it's stored in my body. that I have a knowing and an understanding of that might be genetic. And some of the times I see that, for example, with patients that have the experience of sexual abuse, that have repeated patterns of behavior that they say later on that comes out of nowhere from, from 3 generations down, that are repeating the same kind of cycle of traumatic responses or behavior that has repeated from their parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents. So, it takes a lot of awareness, consciousness, and work for us to be able to stop that cycle of transmission, of traumatic transmission. And I think that's why talking about this is so important. It's disrupting the cycle of trauma, which, takes a lot of courage, a lot of strength, and it's worth it.
Absolutely. What have we learned about the neurological and physical effects of trauma in the last decade?
What are you referring specifically to the changes in the brain? Are you referring, because, depending on the experiences that we've seen, we see that the brain of people who have gone through traumatic experiences has a different characteristics or shapes a little bit different than people that have not gone through trauma. Also, the way our nervous system is wired gives us a lot of information into how we experience trauma. So people that have been in survival mode a lot of the time, in trauma responses, facing danger, emotional danger or psychological danger, are wired in a way in which their nervous system is constantly firing, and it's constantly on guard, and it's constantly looking for how to defend themselves from danger. And we usually see responses, usually 3 or 4 typical responses, which are the fight response, the flight response, the freeze, and the fawn. And when I mean fight, I don't mean just physically fighting. I mean also when you become more irritable, when you have more insomnia, when you're not able to eat well, when you're not sleeping well, when you're constantly picking fights with your family members, with your friends, with your children, when there's very disproportionate reactions to certain things that happen during the day. This can all be fight responses, and there can be stored in the body in ways that you're not even aware. There's very little consciousness sometimes with these responses. And the same with flight response. Flight doesn't just mean you're running away from the tiger that is going to eat you. Flight response can also mean being completely avoidant of a situation, becoming dissociated, disconnecting from your emotions, pretending that something is not happening, pushing problems under the rug, playing dumb like you don't know what's happening, forgetting things that are normally more easy to remember. These are all flight responses, right? And then freeze responses, not only the body has more rigidity and more immobility, but also your mind is I can't make decisions. I don't even know what I'm feeling. I've become numb or anesthetized. I don't feel my feelings. I don't feel anything. I have a very hard time choosing what's right and what's wrong. A lot of the people, for example, during the pandemic were feeling paralyzed, and they could not make decisions. They didn't know where to go. The uncertainty was too much. The dealing with loss was so traumatic. They were literally paralyzed in who they were, in understanding who they were, what they were doing, and what was happening in the moment. So these are things that not just happen in our emotions, but also in our bodies.
And one of the wonderful things that you share in The Unexpected Gift of Trauma is that you've devoted 3 decades to developing your 5-stage framework for post-traumatic growth. How did you create your framework for post-traumatic growth?
So I didn't create it. It was developed through really learning from my patients and really learning from the communities that I was working with, that I repeatedly saw these stages happening. And one of the things that I want to do with my book is give a language to this process. So in the same way, let's say that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross describes and gives languages to the stages of grief, in which we all experience it. You don't have to create it and you don't have to invent it. But knowing that there are stages of grief, you're able to identify it, you're able to process it, you're able to know a little bit what's coming. The same way, the process of post-traumatic growth, starting with the first stage of radical acceptance, which is, because people ask me all the time, so Edith, how do we start this? How does that happen? And I say, well, when you get to the point in your life when you radically accept, honestly, completely, what's happening with you, right? And you say, I am an addict, or I am a victim of sexual abuse, or I am an immigrant who's having difficulty in this moment, or I have been affected by my divorce, or, or the pandemic is, having profound consequences in my life at this moment. But it takes a lot of courage to look at those monsters or that shadow in the eye and say, yes, this is me right now. And some people call that like the deep night of the soul. Some people call that when you touch rock bottom. It's like when the risk, I love this poem by Anais Nin. It says, when the risk of staying a bud is bigger and more painful than the risk of blooming, that's when you begin to go through this process of transformation. And then you go into the second stage, which is the stage of safety and protection, in which you reach out and say, you know what, let me express and say and get validation and recognition and acceptance for what I'm going through. And usually that's when people go into therapy or talk to a religious leader or to a chaplain or to going to a support group. Then you get to talk about it. And of course, this is longer, each stage is more descriptive, but just to mention that the third stage is a new narrative. People start to experience and try out new ways of thinking. It's like, okay, so far my belief system didn't work so well. It was shattered. I don't understand how things work. Let me try out new ways of understanding. Let me see if I can reinvent myself, rewrite my story, try new identities, see the world from a different perspective. And then we go into the fourth stage of integration, in which we not only accept who we are in that moment, but also we integrate who we were before. So I am a whole person just with my past trauma and with my present way of being. And you get to integrate the stories and make it a whole. And then the fifth stage, which is my favorite, is the stage of wisdom and growth. In the stage, people usually voice how appreciative of life they are, how meaningful their relationships are. Usually people have come to some sort of a spiritual awakening. And I don't mean religious, I mean spiritual, like a more connection with the whole, a more interconnectedness, a connection with a higher self. And people usually get to a sense of purpose and meaning. Like usually people turn their pain into purpose, turn their wounds into the medicine. They go from the breakdown into the breakthrough. So it's a very beautiful stage. And this is not linear at all. People go back and forth, sometimes to one thing and another. They go in circles. So it's very flexible how these stages go.
And you refer to the stage of awareness as radical. Why is it radical?
Because we tend, when we are in pain and when we're suffering, our natural response is to defend from that. So as long as we're using avoidance and fighting and paralysis and being triggered, we're not accepting what's happening. We're maybe a little bit knowing that there's something going on, or maybe not, but we tend to defend from that. But it's only when we radically get rid of all these defenses and radically say, okay, I'm open, I'm vulnerable, and I'm willing to accept what's happening to me right now. That's the place when you begin this process.
Or like in the movie Network, where they stuck their head out the window and said, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take this anymore.
Exactly. That's it. Yeah, people usually tell you the story like that. They say, I came a time when I told myself this, and that's when it happened,
Her book is called The Unexpected Gift of Trauma. Dr. Edith Shiro will be back with more after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
Humanity Healing International is a small nonprofit with a big dream. Since 2007, HHI has been working tirelessly to bring help to communities with little or no hope. Our projects are not broad mandates, nor are they overnight solutions, but they bring the reassurance that no one is alone and that someone cares. To learn more, please visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
Grab a cup of tea or a glass of wine and tune in for Inspired Conversations with publisher Linda Joy on Tuesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern. Linda creates sacred space for leading female luminaries, empowering authors, heart-centered female entrepreneurs, coaches, and healers. A soulful venue where guests openly share the fears and obstacles they've overcome, wisdom and lessons learned, and the personal journey that led them to the transformational work they do in the world. Inspired Conversations to empower you on your path to authentic, soulful living.
Imagine yourself being transported to India, to the banks of the Ganga and an ashram in Rishikesh. Visualize that you are welcome to satsang with an American sannyasi who shares the wisdom of her guru. Your visualization has manifested. Join Sattvi Bhagawati Saraswati for inspiration and transformation every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio.
What is dedication?
The thing that drives me every day as a dad is Dariana. We call him Day for short. Every day he's hungry for something, whether it's attention, affection, knowledge. And there's this huge responsibility in making sure that when he's no longer under my wing, that he's a good person. I think the advice I would give is you don't need to know all the answers. The craziest thing was believing that your dad knew everything. So as a dad, you felt like you had to know everything. You had to get everything right. It's okay to make mistakes. As long as it's coming from love, then, it kind of starts to work itself out. I want him to be able to sit back one day and go, we worked together, we did a good job.
That's dedication. Find out more at fatherhood.gov. Brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Ad Council.
Back with Dr. Edith Shiro. Her book is called The Unexpected Gift of Trauma. Dr. Shiro, when someone has processed the 5 stages, what may they do, as you describe it in the book, to stay elevated?
Yes, and staying elevated is a way of saying, okay, now you've learned from yourself and from your relationship with others how you can develop this strength, how you can get to the growth, how you become more conscious and more aware. So what do you do after that? Because life is not linear and life happens, right? All these challenges happen and more adversity might happen and other things. So one of the things that I think it's very important is to become very aware that you are able to sustain these lessons and to face new challenges with the tools that you've developed in all this process. I want to mention something very, very specific, which is a protective factor that I learned about when I was doing my research on the post-traumatic growth, the spiritual part. Did you know that during this spiritual connection, the person that becomes more conscious and more aware tends to develop a part in the brain, in the cerebral cortex, that becomes thicker. And people that have become more spiritual and have become more connected have this thicker part in their cerebral cortex. And what's interesting about that is not only that we're having a physical indicator of this, which already is fascinating. This is research by Dr. Lisa Miller at Columbia University, but also that this is a protective factor against new trauma, against new challenges and new adversity. What does that mean? That means that because you've gone through the process of post-traumatic growth, you already have a protective layer around you facing new challenges and new traumas. So you become more resilient, you become more aware, you have all these tools that you can use for yourself. And to me, that's priceless. That's fascinating and that's incredible. So things to do, be more, use mindfulness. Of course, include meditation in your practice. Use movements. You know, we know now that moving the body, moving ideas, moving emotions, being in movement is always healthy. I always recommend incorporating music and art and dance into our lives, because not only is it fun, but it also is healing. And it's more healing than what we can imagine. Vibration, frequency has healing properties that are very, very important. One of the things that we know from research is cultivating good relationships. And I'm not going to get into all the research about it, but we know that people that live longer, that are happier, that do better in life, have meaningful relationships. So these are all tips and suggestions and ideas to stay elevated, to stay in the growth, to stay in the resilience.
And at the end of The Unexpected Gift of Trauma, you offer some tools that the readers can use. Please tell us about some of those tools.
Well, I offer a couple of questionnaires. I don't know if that's what you were referring to, that
Yes.
were developed by Tedeschi and Calhoun, and the other one developed by Dr. Joseph, which were measurements of post-traumatic growth. And it's very simple questionnaires. One has I think 15 and the other 20 items, and you just respond to that. And it's a way for you to see where are you at in the measuring of post-traumatic growth, which means yes, you're on your way, or you're maybe at the beginning of the stages, or maybe you need to work harder to get to post-traumatic growth. But I think what's important about these questionnaires and about understanding post-traumatic growth is that it is a possibility. The fact that people would know that this is an option, that there is an alternative to trauma, I think it's what's the most important piece of information, and say, yes, there's an outcome to this. There is an exit to the trauma. Trauma isn't a life sentence. We can do something different.
Can you share with us an example of a success story with someone applying your methods? Obviously, you can't mention names, but just an example.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to take this example that is not so extreme, which is during the pandemic, I had a couple that came to me horrified. The wife was horrified that she found her husband cheating on her. And of course, because they were at home with the 4 children and looking at their phones, she saw in his phone all these messages from another woman. And so, of course, she was shocked. She was really speechless. She thought her life was falling apart. She didn't know what to do. She comes with her husband to therapy, and in a very courageous way, instead of deciding to break the relationship, they both decided that they were going to take the risk of going through this process that I was offering them. I said, yes, I mean, a lot of people decide at this point that they're going to separate or that they're going to break their marriage. I'm giving you another possibility. Why don't we try this and see what happens? And they were willing to do it, and they worked so hard to go through the stages of post-traumatic growth. And they were willing to go deep in their dark place of the relationship. They looked at each other and told each other these very difficult things. They worked on what was happening in the past. They were working on the way they communicated, on their intimacy, in their emotional connection, in their contract, their marital contract. And by the end of this process, I'm not going to say it's perfect, But the way that they tell the story is that they have become, it's like a new marriage. They have been, they're married to new people. They understand each other from a different place. They appreciate each other differently. They've transformed themselves in how they relate, not only to themselves, but to each other. Their 4 children have come to me at some point and say, wow, my parents really have done something very different. It's such a good example for us to see what they can do in a relationship. And of course, it's not perfect. I don't want to idealize this because I've seen them later on and they have to, have a little problem here and a tweak there. But the tools that they have and the understanding that they have of each other has deepened the relationship, and that has taken the relationship to places they didn't even think was possible. And that's what I think is, makes such a big difference, and what I appreciate so much.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that with us. We are living at a time of great strife, major instability on so many levels, and of course, the horrors of war in Ukraine and elsewhere. What will those who have experienced this, and especially their children, need to do?
Yeah. When we're talking about collective trauma, especially, the responsibility of the culture and the society of acknowledging what's happened, it's so important. And I'm really, really moved and worried for the children and the descendants of the people that have gone through the Ukraine war, and that have, the things that we're going through in difficult and traumatic times. Because it's not just for the time being now, but how this gets passed on from generation to generation. And one of the things that it's very, very important to do is that to gather in groups, in communities, or even as a nation, even from the leadership, coming from the position of leadership, but also from the ground, in coming together and telling stories, like telling stories about what has happened, how everybody survived, what they did to make it better, how they recognize each other and validate each other's experiences. That's the beginning of a healing process. Because trauma, what it does is fragments and isolates. A war not only distances people because of loss, because of death, because of physical proximity, but also because it tears away the identity of the person, of the family, of the tradition, of the culture. It really undoes like the fabric of the culture, and it takes the community to put it together again in ways that make sense, and for the adults to tell the story to the children, and for gatherings to be able to reconnect with what was the tradition of the culture. But you see what I'm talking about, it's not a one-day thing. This is a whole process that takes time, that requires a lot of support, not just from the leaders, but also from other communities, and for the world to recognize this. That's the way to heal. And I know I'm talking about big things, and I know I'm talking about ideal situations, but if you ask me how to heal, this is what I see.
What would you like readers to take away from the unexpected gift of trauma?
So, Victor, thank you for that question. First of all, that trauma is not a life sentence, and trauma can have the possibility of heal and growth and thrive and transform. The second is that use the book as a way of having the language, the words, the identification of the stages to see where you're at this stage. Are you more in radical acceptance? Are you more in awakening? Are you more in the new narrative stage? Where are you with that? And to know what's coming, to understand where you're in the process. 3, for people that are accompanying or that are friends or family of somebody that is traumatized, this is a very important book because it gives you an idea of what the other person is going through. So it gives you more empathy, more compassion, more understanding. And another one is to understand trauma not just as an individual, but also as a collective systemic experience, that it's relational, that understand that it's not like an isolated event, but that it affects people across the board, and that it affects generations up and generations down in the same way that healing and growth and transformation can do the same. So when we have in the Jewish tradition, when you heal one person, you heal the world. The same. When you're doing the work of growth and transformation, you're transforming everybody around you, and you're transforming your ancestors and your descendants.
The wisdom of Dr. Edith Shiro. Her book is called The Unexpected Gift of Trauma. Dr. Shiro, please tell our listeners one more time where they can get your book and find out more about you.
So they can find the book on all the platforms, Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, any of the indies, Walmart, and audiobook and Kindle. Would love for you to get it, to read it, to have the conversation with me or with others about what moves you from this book. You can find me on Instagram at Dr. Edith Shiro, dr.edithshiro, on Facebook, my website, www.dredithshiro.com, or ask Victor and he'll know where to find me.
Dr. Shiro, thank you so much for joining us and sharing this wonderful and very positive message in a world that needs positivity right now.
Thank you so much for this wonderful invitation. It's been a pleasure talking with you, really.
And thank you for joining us on Destination Unlimited. I'm Victor, the Voice Fuhrman. Have a wonderful week.